Hello and welcome back. Over the last few sessions, we have mastered the fundamentals of Docker. We can build images with Docker files and run individual containers using the Docker run command with all the necessary flags. But let's be honest, modern applications are rarely a single container. A typical web application might have a web server, a backend API, a database, a caching layer like Redis, and maybe a background worker. Managing each of these with separate Docker run commands quickly becomes a long, error prone, and frankly, painful process. So, how do we solve this? The answer is Docker Compose. In this session, we are going to learn how to define and manage multi container applications with a single powerful tool. We will break down the docker-compose.yml file, understand its structure, and run through the essential commands you will use every day when you're working with Docker Compose. Now, before we dive into the details, if you found this content helpful, please hit that subscribe button. It really helps the channel grow and allows me to keep making more videos just like this one. Let's get started with this. So, first question, what is Docker Compose? In simple terms, Docker Compose is a tool that we can use for defining and running a multi-container Docker application. With Docker Compose, we use a YAML file specifically named docker-compose.yml. Now, this is where we define all the configuration. So, we use this to configure all your applications services, your networks, and your volumes. And then with a single command, we can create and start all the services from our configuration. So think of this YAML file as the blueprint and the foreman for your entire application stack. Now, why should we use it? Let's contrast it with how manual Docker run approach works. So imagine you need to run a WordPress application with a MySQL database. The manual way might look something like this. So first, you will create your network. So you can use a Docker network create and let's say your network name. Then you will start the MySQL container, making sure to set the root password, create a database, and then attach it to the new network that we have created. Then you will start the WordPress container, you will link it to the MySQL container, you will set the environment variables for the database host and password, mapping the ports, and attach this to the same network. Now that's at least two long complicated commands you have to remember and type correctly every time. With Docker Compose, you define all of this in your YAML file. The relationship between the services, the environment variables, the ports, the networks, it's all declared in one place. And that YAML file becomes part of your project's code base. Now, using this YAML file, the benefits are huge. One is your simplicity. So, the single file describes the entire application's stack. Then, reproducibility. So, anyone with this file and Docker Compose can spin up an identical environment with one single command. And then version control. You can track changes to your application's infrastructure alongside your source code. And then finally, efficiency. It dramatically simplifies the developer's workflow for development, testing, and CI/CD pipelines. The heart of it all is that Docker Compose YAML file. Now, before you start working with your Docker Compose, you will need to install the tool itself. It does not come by default with the Docker installation. So here I have my repo and here I have the instructions that you will need to run one by one. So first here we are downloading the necessary binaries and I'm putting it to my user local bin directory. Then I'll set the necessary permissions and then here I'm creating a soft link and that's all. So very straightforward. You can validate the Docker Compose and here you can see I have my Docker Compose installed. I'll share the link to this repo so you can follow this. But before you start working the Docker Compose, you will need to install. Now let's look at the Docker Compose YAML file. So what we will do is here, let me create a directory and let's call this as compose demo. And let's go to that. And here we will create our docker-compose.yml file. So again, you will need to follow this naming convention, same as we did with your Docker file. You will need to follow the same docker-compose.yml extension. So This is my YAML file, docker compose YAML file. So first we have the version key over here. This specifies the version of the compose file format we are using. Different versions support different features. We are using 3.8, which is a modern and widely supported version. It's important to note that with the newer Docker Compose v2, like in our case, if you remember, we are using the v2 version. The version tag is often considered optional and it might be omitted, but it's still very common to see. Next, we have the core of the file, the services section. This is where you define each of your containers, which compose refers to as services. So basically, services are your collection of containers. So under services, we have two containers. We have the web and then we have the Redis. The web service is built from the Docker file in the current directory indicated by this build line over here. It maps ports 5000 on the host to port 5000 in the container. It uses a volume to mount our local source code into the container, which is great for development as it allows for live code changes. It also sets an environment variable redis underscore host to point to the other service simply named Redis. The depends on key tells compose that the web service should only be started after the Redis service is started. The Redis service is much simpler. It does not require a build. It just uses a pre-built image from Docker Hub, the Redis Alpine image. So Docker Compose will pull this down if it does not exist locally. Now let's look at two other key sections that can be defined: networks and volumes. If you don't specify a network, Compose automatically creates a default network for your application and all services join it. They can communicate with each other using their service names as a host name. That's why our web service could just use Redis as a host. But you can define custom networks for more control, like isolating services. So here I can define my networks and then I can fill in details for this. I'm not going to do anything with this, but just so you know, we can do it. I will be creating a separate playlist for Docker Compose where I'll be talking about this in details. Similar to your networking, we can also persist data. You can define volumes at the top level, while you can use volume mounts directly in a service definition. Declaring them here makes them easier to manage and reference. So here you can create a volumes section as well. So whatever you get, let's say for example, I'll call this as DB data. So this DB data volume could then be used by a database service to ensure data persists even when the container is removed. The key takeaway is that the docker-compose.yml file is a declarative map of your entire application's infrastructure. You define the what and Docker Compose handles the how. So I'll comment this out because we won't be needing them for now. All right, so we have our blueprint. Now, how do we use this? Let's run through the essential Docker Compose commands. First, make sure in the same directory as your docker-compose.yml file. So here I have the docker-compose.yml file, and then I also have my application code and then the Docker file to build my image for the web service. Now, the most important command, the one you will use all the time, is docker compose up command. This command does it all. It builds, creates, starts and attaches your containers for all the services. If you want to run it in the background, which you often do in production, we can use the -d flag for detached mode. So let's run this command and let's wait for this to complete. And this is done. So you can see here Docker Compose has started our services. It created our network and then both the containers are started. Now, how do we check what's running? We use the docker-compose ps command. This is like the docker ps command, but it only shows the services defined in your current compose file. It's a filtered project based view. So here you can see I have both the containers. This is one and this is the other one. So this is my web and this is my database. So you should see your web and Redis services listed with their state and also your port mappings. Now, what if something goes wrong? You need to see the logs. For that, we use the docker compose logs command. This fetches the logs from all the services. You can also do a tail of your logs from all the services. Like, let's say for example, you want to tail the logs from your web, so I can use hyphen f and then web, and this will show me the logs only for the web service, and this will show you the logs in real time. If you want to follow the logs like troubleshooting and everything, we can do that. So this is invaluable for debugging. Sometimes you need to run a command inside a running container. We learned docker exec for a single container. With compose, we use docker-compose.yml. You specify the service name, not the container ID. For example, to get a shell inside the web container, I would run docker-compose.exec, the service name, and then my interpreter. And you can see I'm inside the service. Or if you want to connect to the Redis CLI, then I can say docker compose exec, the name of your service, and then the interpreter. So let's say CLI, and you can see I'm inside the Redis database. It's so much simpler because you're working with services names defined in your file. Finally, when you're done working and want to tear everything down, you use docker compose down. This is a critical command. It stops all running containers and removes them. It also removes the networks that were created by the docker compose up command. By default, it does not remove volumes defined in the volumes section to protect your persistent data. If you want to remove volumes as well, you can use the -v flag. So I can say docker compose down and then this -v flag. So use it with caution. So we will just run this docker compose down command, and just like that, our entire multi-container application is cleaned up from our system. So you can see this is stopping the web container. The ready service is also done, and my network is also removed. And that's basically what your docker compose is. So whenever we want to run multi-container applications using a single configuration file, we can make use of your docker compose for that. Like I said, I will be creating a separate playlist for your docker compose where we'll be going in depth with your docker compose, but that's all for this session. And that brings us to the end of this session. You have just learned the core concepts of Docker Compose. You now understand the power of your Docker Compose YAML file as a single source of truth for your application stack. You have seen its anatomy with services, networks, and volumes, and you're equipped with the essential commands to manage the life cycle of your application. This workflow is a game changer for development and testing. In the next session, we will talk about the environment variables in Compose, some advanced concepts, and a hands-on lab. If you found this session helpful, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel for more content, and let me know in the comment section if you have any queries. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next session.